Right.
So our snippets for this week will look at foreign policy during the Obama and Trump years. It's worth keeping in mind we're talking about quite recent material here. Not a lot of documents are available, so the conclusions necessarily have to be pretty tentative. So the first snippet's going to look at Obama's first term. So this is the leading candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2008. The big four were Bill Richardson, governor of New Mexico, former ambassador to the UN, Barack Obama, at this point a first term US senator from Illinois, John Edwards, who had served one term in the Senate from North Carolina and then had been the Democrats' vice presidential nominee in 2004, and Hillary Clinton, who at this point is in her second term as a U.S. Senator from New York and previously obviously had been First Lady. The dominant issue, and to me, at the end of the day, the reason that the Obama campaign initially got traction was the war in Iraq. Richardson's campaign sort of stalled, and he was consistently fourth in the polls and was never quite able to make it above that. So it basically became a three-person race between Obama, Edwards, and Clinton. And what most distinguished Obama from Edwards and Clinton is that both Edwards and Clinton in the U.S. Senate had voted for the authorization to use force by George W. Bush against Iraq. Obama, of course, had not been in the Senate at that time, but had made clear in a speech and an interview from 2002 that he opposed the conflict. And this was a period in which the Democratic Party base had become very, very strongly anti-Iraq war. So Obama was able to, I think, quite cleverly make the point that he was on the side of a majority of Democrats for what they saw as the critical issue. Now, as the 2008 campaign proceeded, a whole bunch of other issues emerged, but I think this is sort of what got Obama started. And let's take a listen at very, very young Barack Obama from 2002, talking about his opposition from the war at the time.
I don't oppose war in all circumstances, and when I look out over this crowd today, I know there is no shortage of patriots or patriotism. What I do oppose is a dumb war.
Us rushing headlong into a war unilaterally was a mistake and may still be a mistake. If it has happened, then at that point what the debate's really going to be about is what's our long-term commitment there? How much is it going to cost? What does it mean for us to rebuild Iraq? How do we stabilize and make sure that this country doesn't splinter into factions between the Shias and the Kurds and the Sunnis?
So these statements by Obama, again, it sort of distinguishes him, and the Edwards and Clinton people take differing approaches. Edwards apologizes for his vote for the war and says that he now opposes the war. Clinton chooses not to. Obama wins in the First in the Nation caucus in Iowa, traditionally anti-war state. He does very, very well in the primaries with younger voters who tend to be more anti-Iraq war than older Democrats. But late in the campaign, Hillary comes back with what was the most powerful ad of the 2008 process, the so-called 3 a.m. commercial. So let's take a listen.
It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. But there's a phone in the White House and it's ringing. Something's happening in the world. Your vote will decide who answers that call. Whether it's someone who already knows the world's leaders, knows the military, someone tested and ready to lead in a dangerous world. It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. Who do you want answering the phone?
I'm Hillary Clinton, and I approve this message.
The backstory to this ad is the Clinton campaign was short on funds by this point in the campaign, so they weren't able to shoot the ad themselves. So they used old stock footage. This was apparently a cold medicine ad that they used. But in the event, you see the argument here, right? That Hillary is a more seasoned leader. Obama's young. It played off the belief that the public would see in Clinton not just as a senator, but as the former first lady, someone who would be a more effective steward of the nation's approach to international affairs. And if Hillary had run with this message from the start, it may very well have prevailed. But by the time that she uses this this ad, the ad is prepared in the run up to the Texas primary. It's a more moderate Democratic primary. But by that point, Obama already had what, in retrospect, was an insurpassable lead. So, in the event, in the 2008 campaign, foreign policy initially helps Obama to distinguish himself from Edwards and Clinton. Probably at the end of the primary process, it hurts Obama. In the 2008 campaign, the general election campaign against Arizona Senator John McCain, McCain plays up the fact that he's a more seasoned leader. But by this point, I think any Democrat was going to win due to the economic collapse a couple of months before the election. So Obama is in, and I think the story of Obama's first term is a combination of a couple of things. The first is that he had a very, very solid national security team in the cabinet, especially the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, who was a holdover from the Bush II administration, where he had served as Secretary of Defense, had also run the CIA under Bush I, was seen as a moderate, extremely competent technocrat, and Hillary Clinton, who Obama persuaded to serve as Secretary of State. So it's a solid group. The second is that Obama initially tries to position himself as a beacon of change, largely on the basis of his somewhat complicated identity. You have someone who is of mixed race, who grew up in Hawaii, who no American president had ever come from either Alaska or Hawaii, whose mother, who raised him, was this very, very interesting woman who spent a lot of time overseas. Obama himself was very kind of internationalist in his approach, and so the argument is that after the kind of nationalist Bush years, that Obama represented a different vision of America internationally. This is a photograph of him addressing an audience in Cairo, Egypt in 2009, in which he promises a new look out towards the Islamic world, and arguing that the Bush administration had created a kind of clash of civilizations that was unnecessary to continue. And this rhetoric gets a warm reception internationally. Bush was, by the end of his presidency, very, very unpopular, basically in all countries around the world. Obama receives the Nobel Peace Prize in his first year as president. It's not exactly clear why he gets it, because he didn't really do very much. But nonetheless, there is this sense that he personally embodies change. The irony of the Peace Prize award is that the thrust of Obama's first term successes are him being willing to use force when he deems it necessary. And the most famous of these episodes, you see in the photograph here, came in 2011 when Obama, over the advice of his vice president, Joe Biden, authorized a raid into Pakistan after U.S. Intelligence operatives had obtained evidence that the Pakistani ISI, this intelligence agency that we've talked about previously in the class, was sheltering Osama bin Laden. This intelligence was, it was not certain. I mean, no intelligence is certain. And so it was a very, very risky venture that Obama is undertaking. If it had failed, you would have had U.S. forces moving in unauthorized to an allied country based on a wrong tip. It would have been a quite significant diplomatic failure. And there are some in the administration who recall the failed attempt of Jimmy Carter to rescue the U.S. hostages in Iran in early 1980. But it succeeds. U.S. forces kill bin Laden, and Al Qaeda, although it still exists, is a dramatically less of a threat in the aftermath of bin Laden's defeat. And the bin Laden episode, I think, sort of presents the best image of the Obama foreign policy team, that we have this very talented group of advisors who give to the president candid advice, that the president considers these issues, makes a reasoned decision, and the decision turns out to be correct. The problem for Obama is that's not necessarily representative of what we see elsewhere, even in his first term foreign policy. In that clip that I showed of Obama, where he talks about Iraq being a dumb war, earlier in that speech, which was to an anti-war rally, so it was an interesting set of remarks that Obama gives, he expressed support for the war in Afghanistan. He criticizes Bush, and this was a pretty typical liberal criticism of Bush in 2007, 2008, for turning attention to Iraq and avoiding attention to Afghanistan, where the Taliban had begun to pick up steam. And so Obama authorizes a surge of U.S. troops, and this is you can see from the chart, around 30,000 troops when he takes office, up to around 100,000 troops. And the goal is to push back the Taliban, to give the Afghan government a chance to consolidate its control over the country. I mean, we all know how this story ends, although initially the surge seems to be somewhat successful. Obama is also willing to use force in Libya, which I think is his most controversial first-term foreign policy decision. This is General Muammar Gaddafi, the longtime dictator of Libya, who took office in 1969. And has this strange career where he at times positions himself as an extremely vociferous anti-American figure. He sponsors terrorism against U.S. Service members in Europe during the 1980s. There widespread allegations that Libyan intelligence agents had been involved in the terrorist bombing of an airplane called from Pan Am that explodes in the air over Scotland, killing everyone on board, including dozens of students from Syracuse University who were coming back to the U.S. after having spent a semester abroad. It's just an awful experience. But Gaddafi in the late 90s, and especially during the Bush years, positions himself more open to the U.S. in part because he's afraid of what happened in Iraq, and so there's a bit of a better relationship. In the event, in 2010, 2011, there were a series of uprisings in the Arab world known as the Arab Spring, which are focused, at least initially, in North Africa, first in Tunisia, then in Egypt, and in both cases, the dictatorial governments of these countries fall, and then in Libya. Obama seems to be, although his policy is not super decisive here, Obama seems to be a supporter of the Arab Spring concept, arguing that it's a positive for the United States for democracy to come to the Middle East. The problem, and you see this in Egypt, which elects a Muslim Brotherhood president, democracy is not necessarily compatible with the promotion of pro-American leaders in the Middle East. In Libya, Obama basically concludes that Gaddafi must go, and pushes this policy, which we read about in the reading for this week, called lean from behind, which is that the U.S. is going to be willing to use force to assist the Libyan revolutionaries as long as the Europeans are also willing to do so as well. So Obama doesn't want a repeat of the second Iraq War, where the U.S. is basically on its own. The U.S. Sends forces to Libya to protect revolutionaries who are about to be massacred by Gaddafi's forces in Benghazi, the second largest city in Libya. And soon thereafter, Gaddafi's government falls. Gaddafi is captured by the revolutionaries and is killed. But in the aftermath, what results is not a nice democratic state in North Africa, but something approximating a failed state where the new central government in Libya really exercises very, very little control, and instead you get a bunch of these militia-led fiefdoms throughout the country. The U.S. ambassador to Libya at the time is a man named Christopher Stevens, who's very idealistic, wants to do everything he can to sort of signal U.S. support for Libyan democracy. And in the fall of late summer of 2012, a presidential election year, Stevens is in the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, which is overrun by terrorists who execute him and 3 other Americans. The Obama administration's response to this is a bit inconsistent. They describe the act as terror, but they're not as aggressive, say, as Ronald Reagan perhaps might have been, or W. Bush might have been under similar circumstances. And eventually, the U.S. decides to lessen and ultimately pull out its military forces from Libya. This issue, though, becomes a major issue in the 2012 presidential campaign, but in an extremely weird sort of way. The Republican nominee is Mitt Romney, the former governor of Massachusetts. There seemed to be a really strong argument against Obama on grounds that this showed a failure of competence, that Obama had promised this new, smart, competent leadership. And instead, he had kind of thoughtlessly sided with the revolutionaries in Libya, and then more or less had ignored a deteriorating situation. And ultimately, this failure led to the deaths of 4 Americans, including a sitting U.S. ambassador for the first time since the 1970s. But that's not really the criticism that the Romney people make. Instead, they make a criticism that the Obama people were slow to denounce the episode as terrorism, on grounds that to do so would be out of a fear that doing so would harm Obama's political standing, because one of Obama's big things was to say that the issues of the Middle East were more complicated than simply labeling opponents of the United States terrorism. The problem with all of this is that immediately after the attack, Obama had described it as an act of terror, and so this was not only a strange criticism of Benghazi to make, but it was factually wrong. And this comes back to bite Romney in the second of the presidential debates in 2012, where he goes with this talking point of not labeling it terrorism, which turned out to be inaccurate.
There were many days that passed before we knew whether this was a spontaneous demonstration or actually whether it was a terrorist attack. And there was no demonstration involved. It was a terrorist attack. And it took a long time for that to be told to the American people. Whether there was some misleading or instead whether we just didn't know what happened, I think you have to ask yourself, why didn't we know 5 days later when the ambassador to the United Nations went on TV to say that this was a demonstration? How could we have not known?
Secretary Clinton has done an extraordinary job, but she works for me. I'm the president, and I'm always responsible. And that's why nobody's more interested in finding out exactly what happened than I did. The day after the attack, Governor, I stood in the Rose Garden and I told the American people and the world that we were going to find out exactly what happened, that this was an act of terror, And I also said that we're going to hunt down those who committed this crime.
I think it's interesting the president just said something which is that on the day after the attack, he went in the Rose Garden and said that this was an act of terror. You said in the Rose Garden, the day after the attack, it was an act of terror. It was not a spontaneous demonstration. Is that what you're saying?
Please proceed, Governor.
I want to make sure we get that for the record, because it took the president 14 days before he called the attack in Benghazi an act of terror.
Get the transcript.
He did, in fact, sir. So let me call it an act of terror.
Can you say that a little louder, Candy?
He did call it an act of terror. It did as well take 2 weeks or so for the whole idea of there being a riot out there about this tape to come out. You're correct about that.
So this was just an extraordinary failure where there's the Libya issue seemed to be politically tailor-made for Republicans, and instead they went on this false claim, which gets debunked in live time. It's never a good idea in a presidential debate where you're sort of exposed as wrong on the debate platform. But where Obama is criticized for not describing the thing as an act of terror, rather than for the broader policy failures with regards to Libya. Obama was reelected after his first term, and our next step is going to look at the Obama second term.